There are moments when life places us in front of details so small they seem insignificant. But it is precisely in these details that the truth lives. A hand, for example. Have you ever stopped to observe a hand? Not yours, of course. Someone else's. The wrinkles, the scars, the way it trembles when holding something fragile. Martha's hand trembled that September afternoon. It wasn't cold. The mansion was never cold. That three-story estate with tinted glass in Greenwich, Connecticut, maintained a temperature as controlled as everything else inside. Martha was holding something that shouldn't have been in her hands. An old teddy bear, faded by time, with one ear sewn on irregularly, as if the needle had been guided by small, impatient fingers. The toy weighed more than it should have. She had found the thing in the attic. She shouldn't have been there in the first place. The attic was off limits. Everything in that house had this strange quality of being forbidden, of belonging to a world that Martha's eyes weren't permitted. But it was Thursday, and on Thursdays, she cleaned the second floor, and that's when she saw the door ajar. That old wooden door with the rusted lock that no one used anymore. Curiosity is a luxury that housekeepers generally. Martha was 58 years old and had learned that decades ago. But inside that cardboard box between photographs and newspaper clippings, there was something that transported her back to a time when she too had the right. There was also a photo of a 10-year-old girl on a stage, posture perfect, arms extended like wings. The girl was smiling. Her eyes burned with pure joy. Martha recognized those eyes. She had seen them every day for the last 2 years, but empty. Like opaque glass. Like a light that someone had switched off from. The girl in the photo was Claire. She hadn't heard him arrive. Richard had this peculiar gift of appearing without warning, like a shadow suddenly gaining an outline. His voice shattered the calm of the attic like. "What do you think you were doing here?" Martha turned around. Richard descended the last few steps of the stairs with a deliberate slowness, every footfall echoing. He was wearing one of those imported wool suits that cost more than Martha's annual salary. His graying hair was perfectly combed. The gold watch on his wrist reflected the light of the naked bulb above them. "I was cleaning, sir. I noticed the door was open and—" "Cleaning?" He circled the box like a predator. "You weren't hired to touch things that aren't yours." "No, sir. I'm sorry, sir." Martha reached out to put the teddy bear back in the box. She had learned that apologies must be accompanied by swift action, swift obedience, swift invisibility. That was how you survived in houses like this. "Leave it." Richard's voice changed tone. Less fury, more disdain. "Do you have any idea how much space these things take up? Everything here needs to be discarded. Trash. It's all trash." He pointed to the box as if pointing at a dead rat. "You can throw it out when you're done here. And Martha, don't mention any of this to anyone in the house. Leave everything." He went up the steps without waiting for an answer. His silhouette disappeared onto the second floor. Martha stood there for a time she couldn't measure. That ability to track time had left her body some years ago. She looked at the teddy bear again, the sewn ear, the black bead eyes. And without thinking much about the consequences, without that deliberation that years of survival had taught her, Martha stuffed the toy inside her apron. The fabric was thick, white cotton. The bear disappeared completely. She descended the steps slowly. The hand on the railing was the hand of a woman who had lost her daughter 20 years ago. Not in the same way Claire had been lost, not exactly. Martha's daughter had died of cancer at 23, but there were slower, quieter forms of death. There were ways for a person to disappear while they were still breathing. When she reached the foyer on the first floor, Claire was in the living room. That immense room with furniture no one used, with drapes that filtered the light in shades of gold. Claire was sitting in a cream-colored leather armchair, staring at the window, or Martha was no longer able to tell the difference. The young woman wore one of those wool dresses her mother chose for her. Her hair was styled impeccably, not a strand out of place. She looked like an expensive doll. Bella, Martha's daughter, had a doll like that when she was little. It didn't have a facial expression either. Martha approached slowly. She didn't want to startle Claire. She had learned over time that abrupt movements made the girl's body stiffen, as if expecting a blow. "Hi, Claire," Martha said softly. "How are you doing?" Claire didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the window. Martha placed a hand on the back of the armchair. With the other hand, the one inside the apron, she felt the bare, the soft fabric, the old stitching. "I have something to show you," Martha continued. "But you need to come with me. Will you come?" Nothing. Just the sound of the central air conditioning humming above, in that invisible system that kept everything in that house at a constant, artificial, lifeless temperature. Martha took her hand out of the apron and held it out. In it, she held the bear. Toby. She had read the name on a tag stitched into the... Something happened then. Claire's eyes moved. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, those empty eyes focused on something. They focused on the bear. And then, slowly, as if waking from a very deep sleep, Claire lifted her head. Her mouth opened slightly. It wasn't a word. It was a sound. Something between a whisper and a sigh. Something between silence and language. Martha felt her eyes sting. She had sworn to herself she wouldn't cry at this job. Tears were a luxury women like her couldn't afford. But looking at that girl, seeing that tiny spark of light returning to those eyes. Silent promise. A promise that would cost her everything she had built over 58 years. She was going to bring Claire back. In the days that followed, Martha learned that compassion is an act of silent resistance. You don't talk about it. You don't announce it. You simply execute it in the spaces between things, in the moments when no one is looking. The first conversation happened while she was brushing Claire's hair. It hadn't been requested. Martha simply walked into the girl's room on Monday morning with an ivory brush in her hand and began. Claire was motionless on the bed, the same empty gaze as always. But this time Martha chose not to accept silence as the final. Martha said, running the brush through the long, straight hair. "When I was young, my daughter had hair exactly like yours. No, wait, it was even darker, almost black, and she hated when I tried to comb it, always." Claire's hand didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on an undefined point on the ceiling. Bella was stubborn, very stubborn. She used to say she'd rather look like a witch than sit there while I played with the type. Martha smiled to herself in the mirror. "I think you two would have been friends. You both had this way of not wanting to talk to anyone. But Bella, she understood. She understood everything, even when she didn't say a word. Every movement was careful. Martha divided the hair into 3 sections and started to braid it. Her hands had memory. How many times had she done this? 1,000 times? 10,000? This braid, for example, Bella hated it, said it was too tight, but when I finished, she'd run to the mirror and admire herself for hours. I think every girl likes to be cared for like that." There was no answer, just the sound of the brush bristles meeting the strands of hair. But on Tuesday, when Martha returned to do the same, Claire was sitting at the edge of the bed already waiting. She hadn't asked. She had. Martha felt something break inside her chest, that hardened thing that had kept her alive for so many years. The conversations started happening daily. Martha talked while she cleaned the room, while she changed the flower water, while she opened the curtains to let the sun into that space that insisted on remaining dark. "You liked ballet," Martha said one day, while folding clothes. "I saw the photo. You were beautiful on that stage, so graceful, like you were flying." Claire's fingers moved, just a small tremor, but Martha saw it. She mentally registered every detail, like someone collecting breadcrumbs in a dark forest. Bella never wanted to do ballet. She wanted music, violin, said ballet was for weak princesses. Bella wanted... Martha laughed, that kind of laugh that comes from deep down. She never got to be strong enough in the end. Nobody is, I guess. Martha left small gifts. A white feather she had found in the garden, placed on the nightstand. A flower, still with dew, left on the window pane. A leaf with a peculiar shape. Small objects, things that could easily be discarded as trash. But when Claire touched them, her fingers opened slightly, as if experiencing the texture of the world for the... By the end of the week, Claire murmured something. Not proper words. It was a sound. Martha couldn't understand it, but she wept while scrubbing the bathroom floor, her tears falling onto the... Eleanor, the mother, began to notice. She was a woman who spent her days in a medicated fog, wrapped in silk robes that cost more than entire houses. But even she, sunk into that gray velvet sofa in the living room, managed to see the change. She mentioned it to Martha, while pointing at a spot on the ceiling. "You're being too kind to Claire." It wasn't an accusation. It was more of a clinical observation. When a doctor points out a symptom in your body and you want to protest, but you know he's right. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Martha replied. "Yes, but not like that." Eleanor closed her eyes. There were dark circles under them. "Don't encourage hope in her. Hope is dangerous. The doctor said she will never get better. So it isn't kind to create false impressions. It's cruel." Martha continued cleaning the mirror. The confrontation came on Friday night. Richard found Martha's gifts on top of Claire's nightstand. The feather, the flower now wilted. A small chain that Martha had taken off her own neck. A gift she had kept from Bella for over 20 years. He walked into the kitchen where Martha was organizing the cleaning supplies for Saturday. His face had that wax mask quality it assumed when he was about to explode. "What are you doing with my daughter?" Martha looked up. She knew this tone. It was the same tone she had heard directed at Eleanor countless times. The tone of absolute authority. "Just talking, sir, while I do my work." Talking. He repeated the word as if it were an insult. You weren't hired to talk to her. You were hired to clean. And these... He held the items out toward her, the contempt in his fingers. "These pieces of trash you're leaving around, stop it immediately." She started to what? To speak, to get better. He laughed. It was a sound that held no warmth. "You are creating fantasies. My daughter was diagnosed with severe depression and selective mutism. She isn't a dog you train by throwing biscuits. She is a clinical case. The best doctors in the country failed. Do you really believe your work as a cleaning lady is going to make a difference?" "No, sir, You are here to clean. Clean. Not to establish relationships. Not to try to save anyone. You have no qualifications for that. You didn't even finish high school." The words were spoken with surgical precision. Each one fine. "Starting Monday, you will be responsible only for the exterior areas. The grounds, the garage, the facade. You do not enter the house anymore. You do not speak to Claire anymore. You do not exist to her." "Sir, please. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Martha was removed, transferred to the outside. She started arriving earlier while it was still dark and leaving later when night had already fallen. Her job now was to care for what was invisible to the eyes of visitors, the areas no one looked at. On Monday morning, while sweeping dry leaves in the driveway, Claire appeared at the second-floor window, just for a moment, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes searching. Martha kept sweeping. She couldn't look up. She couldn't believe there were cuts in the leaves she swept, caused by the tears falling from her eyes. That night, as she left through the garage, she found the chain she had given Claire hanging on the doorknob. The chain she had inherited. Someone had placed it there, purposefully, where Martha wouldn't fail. She put the chain. And that night, while riding the crowded subway back to her small apartment, Martha understood that there are moments when resistance isn't enough. There are moments when you have to fight. And by fighting, Martha's day off was always Wednesday. That was when she went to the grocery store, when she paid the water bill, when she allowed her body to rest for those few hours when she didn't need to be invisible. But on that Wednesday in October, Martha did something her entire life of caution had taught her never to do. She acted on impulse. The ballet teacher's address was found through an old web page, a blog about the stories of retired instructors in the region. Madame Helen, 65 years old, lived in a small apartment in Yonkers. Martha spent a week's worth of grocery money on an Uber to get there. The door that opened revealed a petite woman, with white hair pulled back in a perfect bun, even at home. Her eyes were blue, and there was something in them that reminded her of Bella's eyes when Martha showed her old photos. Good afternoon. My name is Martha. I would like to speak about one of your students, Claire. Helen's body stiffened. Martha saw the change happen in real time, as if someone had... How do you know Claire? I work... Helen didn't invite Martha in, but she didn't close the door either. The two stood in the hallway of the building, between the smell of cooking from other apartments and the distant hum. Claire was my best student, Helen said, her voice breaking. At 15, she already had the technique of a professional ballerina. Grace. That way of floating in the air that can't be taught. You're either born with it or you aren't. Martha waited. There was an important showcase, a festival where dancers from the entire tri-state area participated. It was Claire's opportunity to be seen by real ballet schools, academies that grant scholarships to national... Helen walked into the apartment and Martha followed. There were photos hanging on the wall, girls in ballet. Her mother was submissive to her husband, completely voiceless. But that day, she showed up backstage because there was a fight. I heard the shouting coming from the waiting room. They were in the small living room filled with souvenirs from trips to places where ballet was sacred. Paris, Moscow, New York. What happened? Martha asked. Richard had scheduled a business dinner that night with important investors, and he demanded that Claire leave the performance. He said dance exhibitions were a rich kid's hobby, that the family's presence was more important for her financial future than any stage. Helen sat in a velvet armchair. Her fingers were trembling. Claire refused. For the first and only time in her life, she disagreed with her father. She said no. She said she was going to dance, that she had trained for 3 years for... Helen took... But Richard is a man who does not accept being contradicted, especially not by a teenage daughter. There was a scene. I didn't witness it, but people around heard it. He called her ungrateful, selfish, a disappointment. And her? What did Claire do? She danced. Helen looked at Martha. She danced as if she were on the edge of a cliff, as if every movement was her last chance to be seen, as if she were apologizing while demonstrating her beauty. It was the most breathtaking performance I have ever seen. Everyone in the auditorium was crying. Helen pulled a folder from an old cabinet. Inside, there were printed photos. A 15-year-old girl in an arabesque position, body as light as air, eyes closed in concentration and ecstasy. And then, Richard didn't even let her receive congratulations from her friends. He dragged her out of the theater. She left here a 15-year-old girl who had mastered an art and got into a car with an enraged man, and she came out of it. Helen leaned her head back against the armchair. She never came back to ballet, never answered my emails again. Her mother sent a message once saying Claire wasn't well, and that the doctors recommended she step away from activities that overstimulated her. Activities? That girl died in that car, Martha. While he drove to his business dinner, his daughter died there right beside him. Martha returned to the mansion that night. It was Wednesday, her day off when no one expected to see her there. She used the key she had stolen weeks ago from that ring that stayed in a bowl. The attic was dark, but Martha knew her way now. She knew where to step to avoid making noise. She knew where the box was. Inside it, there was more than she had seen before. There was a diary. The pages were full of drawings of ballerinas, and also words, sentences that began and ended in imaginary that Martha could hear between the lines. She was reading an entry. Daddy said I am a waste of money. When she heard, Eleanor appeared on the attic stairs. She was barefoot, wearing a white robe. Her face had that unmade-up quality, real, that only appeared when the medication left her in that intermediate state between wakefulness and dream. Martha. The voice was fresh. Ma'am, I can explain. You love her. It wasn't a question. It was a tired declaration. Eleanor descended the last few steps and sat on an old box. The way I should love her. And Martha closed the diary. That night, in the car, after the theater, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tears began to fall silently. Richard stopped at an isolated spot on the highway. He was furious, driving too fast, and at one point, he drove off the road, intentionally accelerated onto the shoulder. He wanted to scare Claire, punish her for the disrespect. The car almost flipped. Claire saw his face in that moment, saw the pure rage. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Martha. She understood in that moment that her father hated her, that he was capable of killing her. And after that, after knowing that truth, how could she speak again? How could she live normally knowing that the person who was supposed to protect her? Richard's footsteps echoed in the hall. "Does he know you're here?" Martha asked. Before Eleanor could answer, Richard appeared in the attic. His silhouette blocked the light coming from downstairs. His eyes scanned the space, found Martha, and something in him transformed into pure fury. "You," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was more terrifying than any scream. "You didn't learn your lesson? Sir, get out of my house, now, or I'm—" Martha didn't argue. She knew this kind of fury. She had spent 58 years learning when to give up. But as she descended the steps, going down the hallway, being pushed by the private security Richard had called, Martha saw Claire in the living room. The girl was sitting in that same leather armchair, watching. Martha did something she had never done before, something completely irrational. Through the open living room doorway, she threw the teddy bear. Toby flew through the air, his movement slow and floating as if he were dancing, and landed at Claire's feet. The girl looked at the bear, and then lifted her eyes to Martha. And in that moment, something broke in Claire. Her mask of emptiness collapsed completely. Her eyes filled with tears that seemed to have waited a decade to fall. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if she finally had permission to feel all the horror that had been frozen inside her. Martha was dragged out of the house, through the doors, through the garage, to the street, and as she was taken away, scream from Claire that wasn't silence, which was, paradoxically, the most beautiful sound Martha had heard in a decade. The sound Claire made wasn't exactly a scream. It was something more primitive. It was the sound of a child finally finding permission, not. Martha, still at the iron gate of the mansion, saw everything happen through the tinted glass of the living room. Claire was hugging the bear against her chest as if she could absorb it. Her fingers moved frantically over the faded fabric, searching for something, searching inside that toy that had been a childhood companion, that had been hidden in the attic. The security guards held her firmly by the arm, but Martha couldn't take her eyes off Claire. The girl found what she was looking for. Her fingers located the irregular stitching on the ear, the same stitching Martha had noticed that first day in the attic. And with a strength that seemed to come from a place very deep inside her, Claire ripped the ear. The plush opened, and something fell onto the. From a distance, it looked like just a broken toy losing its stuffing, but there was something else. There was a glint, a small object. Martha managed to break free. A moment, time enough to see that it was a pendant, a miniature ballet slipper made of silver, and attached to it, or possibly mechanically coupled, was something Martha recognized because she had seen these devices at the precinct when she had to go there years ago to file a. It was a memory card. Old. The type that could fit inside a teddy bear. The type that someone carefully had inserted inside a child's toy like a buried secret. Claire picked up the object from the floor, and with a care that contradicted the chaos around her, held it in the palm of her open hand. The living room door opened. Richard entered like a contained storm, his face a mask of absolute control that couldn't hide the panic in his eyes. "Give that to me," he said to Claire, his voice dangerous. Claire didn't answer. She just looked at the chip in her hand. But in that moment, Eleanor appeared behind Richard. She had come down from the attic. Her white robe was open, revealing a skeletal body beneath an expensive silk slip. Her eyes held a lucidity they hadn't had in years. "No," she said simply. Richard turned to her as if she were a piece of furniture that had started to speak. "Go back to your—" "No." Her voice was fragile, but firm. I'm not going back to the room. I'm not going to pretend anymore. You destroyed her. You destroyed my daughter, and now you want to destroy the proof. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Eleanor walked over to Claire and knelt before her. I always knew since that night. You told me. You were so scared you threw up on the way home. You whispered in my ear, "Daddy is going to kill us," because I saw. Martha, still outside, saw everything. The guards let her go when they saw Eleanor kneeling. Even security had limits. There was something happening there that was beyond their responsibility. You were a child, Eleanor continued, stroking Claire's hair. You were 10 years old, and he put you in that car that day because he wanted you to be a witness. He wanted a family alibi. He wanted your innocent presence to cover him. Claire looked at her mother. For the first time in years, there was a question in her eyes. You saw, my love. You saw your father taking money from bad people, people who buy officials. And when you saw, he saw that you saw, and you understood in that moment that he was capable of anything, that he could hurt you, that he could destroy you if you said a word. Eleanor took the chip from Claire's hand with delicacy, held it up to the light. So you hid this. You sewed this inside Toby because it was the only way you knew how to keep the truth safe. Like a child who cannot speak, you documented everything. You clever girl, you smart little girl. Martha, now unrestrained, entered the house. The guards didn't stop her. Even they seemed paralyzed by what was unfolding. It recorded everything by accident, Eleanor said, still kneeling. The car's dashcam security. He didn't even know, forgot to turn it off. Your father committed the perfect crime, except that a 10-year-old child unknowingly. Richard was motionless near the door. His face had the quality of a mask that was starting to slip. And then, for a decade, you carried this secret. And when Martha arrived, when you saw someone wanting to rescue you from the silence, you understood that you could trust. You could. Eleanor extended the chip to Martha. Take this. Give it to the police. Give it to whoever needs to know. Because my daughter deserved to live. She deserved to dance. She deserved to be a normal girl who sometimes cried and sometimes laughed and sometimes made stupid teenage mistakes. Instead, she became a permanent witness to her own father's crime, and she carried that weight alone. Martha took the chip. Her fingers were trembling. Richard finally moved, but not forward, backward. He moved toward the 360-degree security camera that was fixed in the corner of the room. That camera that documented every movement, every angle, every transaction that happened inside. They have the proof, he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to himself, as if pronouncing the sentence. His face changed. All the arrogance, all the coldness, all that composure of a man who had built an empire on corruption and fear. What was left was just a man terrified by the reality that. Martha walked to the door with the chip in her hand. Claire approached her, and for the first time in a decade, the two embraced. Claire's body was fragile. But there was something in it now. A presence, a weight, a reality that had returned. Thank you, Claire whispered on Martha's shoulder. 2 words, after 10 years, 2 simple words that contained the entire universe of a trauma finally named. Eleanor stood up. She walked over to her husband, and with a calm that mirrored the coldness he had shown for decades, she looked him in the eyes. You are going to answer. The precinct smelled of coffee that was too fresh and desperation that was. Martha had spent most of her life avoiding places like this. Police stations were for people who couldn't disappear. But that day, with the chip in her hand, she no longer had the option of being. The detective was a middle-aged man with deep bags under his eyes. He listened to everything Martha had to say and typed every word into a form as if he were translating from a form. When she mentioned the name Richard Miller, his fingers stopped on the keyboard for a moment. Do you have any idea who this man is? He asked without looking up. I do, Martha replied. And you come in here with a cleaning lady as a. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Martha sat straighter in the plastic chair. I have proof, a video. A sick daughter who doesn't speak, Claire Miller? I've seen the medical reports. Severe depression, selective mutism. Any two-bit lawyer discredits her in 5 minutes. But the detective opened the chip on the precinct computer. The image appeared pixelated at first, and then sharpened. A parked car, an isolated road. Richard handing a heavy briefcase to a man in a dark suit. The man's face was clearly visible. His too. Both knowing what the car's internal security camera had captured everything perfectly. And then, in the rearview mirror, small and scared, 10 years old, eyes wide, watching her father commit a crime, watching him realize he had been seen. Richard's voice on the video was distinct, controlled and cold. You never saw this. You weren't here. You forget. Claire on the screen nods. Too small, too afraid. The press showed up at the mansion 2 days later. There were journalists from 3 different networks. The state police were involved now. A large-scale corruption investigation had been opened, branching into various sectors of the municipal government. Richard had sold permits, approvals, contracts. Everything was connected. But Richard was a man who had spent 50 years learning how to control narratives. He hired the best lawyer in the city, and when the time came to speak to the press, he did so with the confidence of someone who had written his own ending. He descended the mansion stairs with Eleanor by his side. She had been medicated again, her face an empty mask, and positioned himself before the reporters with the composure. "These accusations are completely unfounded," he said, his voice full of gravity and authority. "I have proof that I am the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a disgruntled employee who was fired for theft, and my daughter, who suffers from a well-documented mental illness, is being exploited by this woman to fabricate false narratives. This is slander. This is blackmail. And my family will no longer tolerate this." The journalists asked questions. His lawyers answered. History was being rewritten in real time. The logic of corruption and power was simple. A cleaning lady against a millionaire. A mentally ill girl against a respected businessman. The question wasn't who was telling the truth. It was who had the resources to make the truth matter less. That was when the door on the upper... Claire descended the stairs. She was hugging the teddy bear against her chest. Her bare feet touched every step with deliberation. Her eyes, formerly empty, were focused, fixed on her father. The press instinctively turned. The cameramen... There was something about that girl coming down the stairs that was magnetic, hypnotizing, as if all the energy in the house converged on that moment. Richard's speech died in his throat. Claire reached the final landing. She opened her mouth, and the first thing that came out was simple. Lie. Her voice was hoarse, rusty from disuse. But it was clear. It was real. It was undeniable. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the journalists with their cell phones raised stopped breathing. "You," Claire continued, pointing at Richard, "put that car in reverse when you left that road. You accelerated. You wanted me to be afraid. You wanted me to never tell." Her memory, sealed by a decade of trauma, opened like a poison. The gray sedan, license plate SCP-4421. The man wore a large gold ring with a diamond. "You said 50% or I call your cousin." He laughed. "You put the briefcase in the back seat. You looked at me in the rearview mirror and saw that I was watching. And your face changed. Your face turned into the one you hide from everyone. The one you use only." The journalists began to record. The police. "You said that if I opened my mouth, you would make me disappear like you disappeared my ballet photos, like you disappeared my dreams. And I believed you, because you are my father and fathers don't lie to their children about things like that. Or they shouldn't, at least. You should have loved your daughter. Instead, you used me. And when I realized who you were, you buried me alive." Her voice gained strength with every word, as if every sentence freed her 1 millimeter more from the ground. "My name is Claire. I am 25 years old. And for 10 years I carried the secret that my father is a criminal. But I won't..." The police reached Richard. His hands were placed behind his back. The handcuffs shone under the reporter's lights. The man who had built an empire on petty corruptions, on silent screams of fear, on the power to make people disappear, now disappeared himself, in front of everyone, on live television. Claire descended the last few steps. She walked over to Martha, who was standing near the kitchen door, tears streaming freely down her face, and she hugged her, tight, as if trying to absorb all the strength Martha had offered during those months. Eleanor approached them. She took off the sunglasses Richard had placed on her face. Her eyes had a lucidity that had been missing for years. She joined the hug. The three women, united, while the man who had imprisoned them was taken away by the police. 6 months later, in a modest dance studio in Brooklyn, Claire was dancing. It wasn't the ballet of before. It didn't have the technical rigidity of the 10-year-old girl who dreamed of big stages. But it had something that girl never had. Freedom. Her movements were free, exploratory. Her body expressed things that her mouth had remained silent about. Martha and Eleanor were sitting on folding chairs at the back of the studio. Beside them, on a small suspended TV, a silent news ticker scrolled. Richard Miller, convicted of corruption, embezzlement of public funds, and psychological coercion, sentenced to 23 years in prison. His empire crumbled, his assets frozen. Martha held Eleanor's hand while watching her daughter. Because Claire was her daughter now, as truly as Bella had been, as truly as the 58 years of her life allowed, dancing under the simple white light of a small... Claire spun, leaped. Her hair flew, and for the first time in a decade her face was alive, present, here. The cleaning lady who had entered a house as invisible had left as the instrument of a liberation. Not a salvation. Liberation. Because Claire had... Martha had just opened the door that had been locked for so long. The teddy bear Toby was hanging on the studio mirror, now a relic. Material proof that buried secrets eventually resurface. That courage can come from the most unlikely source. That sometimes compassion is the most revolutionary form of resistance. And that justice, although slow, eventually, inevitably arrives. It's revolting to see someone treated like that, isn't it? If you also believe that justice must be served, smash that like button right now to support Claire and other survivors who need to be heard. This story taught us that voice is power, that the truth, no matter how much it is silenced, always finds a way. And that compassion, the genuine ability to see who is suffering and act, is what makes us human. If you like emotional stories like this, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because stories like this need to be told, and voices like Claire's need to be heard.